Can I welcome members, officers and the public watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the Police and Crime Committee. In addition, I would like to welcome Assembly Member Tony Devenish in accordance with Standing Order 8.2. I have agreed that Assembly Member Devenish may attend this meeting and participate in the discussion with invited guests at item 10. In accordance with government regulations, we are holding this meeting on a virtual basis with Assembly members and guests participating remotely. I will call Assembly members to speak by name during the question and answer session, and I will also introduce each guest as they join us. Our main item of business today is a question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. But first, we have a number of items of formal business to go through before we begin this discussion. Members of the public may like to follow us on Twitter at London Assembly and take part in the meeting discussion using hashtag AssemblyPolice. 3 weeks ago, today, 8 innocent people lost their lives in a horrific attack at London Bridge. Today, we remember them and all of those who were affected on that day. Also, over the last week, we've seen protests sweep across America and also seen protests here in the United Kingdom in the wake of the horrific death of George Floyd at the hands of an American police officer. I would like to express my solidarity with those who have been deeply affected by this incident and to say that I sincerely hope that this is a moment of change with regards to the way in which minority communities are treated and policed by police forces in our society. I know that members may have questions that will be asked later today on the Metropolitan Police's relationship with our BME communities here in London, but this can be picked up later on in this meeting. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Howie, to confirm the names of the Assembly members who are virtually present at this meeting and any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. The Assembly members who are currently present for this virtual meeting are yourself, the Chair, Assembly Member Desai, the Deputy Chairman, Assembly Member O'Connell, Assembly Member Arnold, Assembly Member Berry, Assembly Member Dismore, Assembly Member Duval, Assembly Member Hall, Assembly Member Pigeon, Assembly Member Whittle. We have Assembly Member Devenish observing today. We've received no apologies for absence, so we should be expecting Assembly Member Arbour shortly.
Thank you, Lauren. Agenda item 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2? Noted? Thank you.
Noted.
Thank you. Can I also ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests and other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality, which are not reflected on the authority's register of gifts and hospitality, where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting? Okay?
No.
I don't hear anything, so I assume there are no disclosable pecuniary interests. Agenda item 3, membership of committee. Can I ask members to note the membership and chairing arrangements?
Agreed.
Agreed, thank you.
Agreed.
Agenda item 4, terms of reference. Can we note the committee's terms of reference? Noted.
Agreed.
Thank you. Agenda item 5, standing delegations. Can we note the standing delegations of authority to me, Chair of the committee, as set out in the agenda and as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 15th of May 2020? Noted?
Noted.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Noted.
Agenda item 6, the minutes. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meetings held on the 12th of February and the 4th of March 2020 to be signed by me as a correct record? Agreed? Confirmed?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Agenda item 7, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed, ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and additional correspondence as listed in the report?
Agreed.
Thank
Noted.
you. Agenda item 8, action taken under delegated authority. Can I ask the committee to note the recent actions taken by me as chair under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members and Caroline Pigeon, Assembly member, as listed in the report? Noted?
Noted.
Thank you.
Noted.
Agenda item 9, responses to committee outputs. Can I ask the committee to note the responses received to its outputs as listed in the report?
Noted.
Noted. Thank you. Agenda item 10, question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service, which is our main item of business today, our monthly Q&A, question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. And I would like to formally welcome our guests, Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, and the Commissioner, named Cressida Dick. Welcome, Commissioner. Welcome, Deputy Mayor. So now I move to our set of questions. I'll start off on the first set of questions. So if you just bear with me. The first set of questions, Commissioner, Deputy Mayor, is on COVID-19 and the Met's response. Commissioner, if I can start off with you, please. You stated, Commissioner, that the benefit arising from the fall in crime over lockdown was freeing up officers to focus on more serious crimes, including violent crime. How do you intend to keep a grip on violent crime and prevent it rising to pre-lockdown levels? And do you have confidence that the Met will be able to control the expected rise in all crimes as lockdown eases?
Chair, we are obviously entering a phase of the city's fight against the COVID virus, and the last few weeks have been really dreadful, very sad for so many people, frightening for everybody, and have clearly the virus has impacted on some people and some communities even more than others. I do want, if I may, just quickly to acknowledge, first of all, the high levels of compliance we've seen from the public in relation to COVID restrictions, and also the achievements of the Met during this time, one of which you have been talking about there. We set out to provide best service, to be a reassuring and visible presence to the public, to prevent crime, bring more violent offenders to justice, which we've done, and I'll come back to. Also, of course, to continue to grow and develop the Met for the future, keeping our public safe and wherever we possibly can, improving relationships with the public, or at least maintaining them. I'm proud of what the officers and staff have done, despite the unprecedented and complex changes in the law. The engagements have been overwhelmingly friendly and positive. We've rarely resorted to enforcement of restrictions, regulations. I know we'll come back to that. It's not been easy for my teams. I believe they've got the balance right. As you said, most crimes have fallen dramatically. We have been shifting our resources to work hard, for example, to protect people who might be feeling vulnerable in their own homes. But most crime types have reduced. And the Met has remained largely very resilient and healthy and in a very good shape operationally. However, I should pause at that moment just to note, very sadly, we have lost 3 police staff colleagues apparently to COVID in this time period. We've had some stark results in arrests of violent criminals, extraordinary seizures of cash, drugs, firearms and knives in the last few weeks. I can give you some more examples if you like, but we are absolutely determined not only to continue with all the other elements I've described, including growing the Met. We had another 350 join us last week. You'll be aware of lots more volunteers and special time, but we haven't wasted a single day in suppressing violence, and we will continue to do that. And our ambition is to make sure that the violence does not come back onto the streets of London in the same way that we were experiencing, for example, last year. I'm very confident in the plans we have. We are using the growth in the Met, the extra capacity in the Met, and the extra relationships that we have created in the last few weeks to bear down on violence, particularly those people who are most prone to violence, weapon carriers, violent men almost entirely, and also those places that we know are real hotspots for high levels of violent crime.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think you will be asked in due course about the work of the violence suppression units.
Yeah.
And I noticed there was an article in the Observer on Sunday where the reporter went on patrol in Croydon and what is referred to as microbits. Police hope to reclaim London streets from gangs. But if I can just turn to another question, a very important, pertinent question at this stage. What additional measures have been and will be implemented to address the increasing rates of hate crimes, particularly those directed towards Londoners of Southeast Asian heritage?
Thank you. We have seen, particularly at the beginning of the arrival of the virus into the United Kingdom, some increases in hate crime towards people who appear or are in fact of Southeast Asian heritage, including a couple of very high profile and extremely nasty incidents, very well investigated, I may say. We've been reaching out into all our communities that feel vulnerable to hate crime, but let's focus on that one through our contacts, through colleagues here on the line, through our staff support associations. We have tried to give the best possible service. We've also been sending to any incidents that do happen. In the main, they have been online, and in the main, therefore, they are ones where most people don't want somebody to be brought to justice. They simply want it to stop. So we've been working closely with the companies to reduce those. And we have seen a reduction in the last few weeks in relation to East Asian hate crime targeted towards people of Southeast Asian origin. And we will continue to do that. Hate crime at all times is, something we take very seriously. We have a zero tolerance attitude towards crime that is motivated by hate. And now, of all times, we need to be ensuring that our communications and our engagement with our communities are really effective, and people realise that they should come to us. And there are third-party ways in which they can get to us if they don't want to speak directly. You are familiar with what we do, Ramesh. Suffice to say, we're taking very seriously at the moment. We haven't seen huge rises across the board. We have not.
Sure. Commissioner, I actually welcome your stated determination and your zero tolerance about hate crimes, and that's really appreciated. I mean, the figures are a bit disturbing because in terms of people of Chinese ethnicity, there were 267 hate crimes in the first 3 months of this year, whereas over the whole of 2019, people of Chinese ethnicity faced 375 hate crimes. So disturbing trends, but I note your determination, commitment, and your zero tolerance. So you don't have to respond to what I've just said about those particular figures. Can I just raise something which has been raised by members of Parliament? The use of terminology is quite important. The Financial Times reported hate crime against, quote, Oriental people, unquote, in London soars, police data show. Is this, now this might be a matter for the Office of National Statistics. You obviously follow what the government tells you how to record ethnicity. But is that ethnicity criteria that you use? Because some MPs have got on record that they feel the use of terminology and press reporting that follows does not help.
I'm sorry, sir, you were breaking up a little bit to me there. I think what I heard was the Financial Times article talking about Oriental.
Yeah.
And you were asking, is that one of the categories that we use, or a terminology that we generally?
Yeah.
As you are aware, we are subject to government.
Indeed.
And Home Office.
Indeed.
Rules in relation to how, when we speak to somebody on the street, we ask them how they define themselves according to a very limited number of categories, some of which are frankly very clumsy sounding. I think the best thing I can do is to send across to you those categorizations. Sure. and say to you that we as police officers and police leaders will always try to, when we're talking with people, to communicate in a way which is going to both make sense to them and not be offensive to them.
Absolutely.
But the times change and what is appropriate changes. And we do have to stick to the appearance charts that we are given to use by the government, by the Home Office, and others. As far as I am aware, none of our categories refer to Oriental.
Right, okay.
I hope that helps.
Thank you, Commissioner. If you could correspond with me in due course. I think Assemblymember Len Duval wants to come in.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Commissioner. Can we just go back to the violent crime suppression strategy? Could you just explain a little bit more than that? Is it a unit that's been established? Is it only working in key areas? And I saw some publicity earlier on, and I think it's a great strategy, and I understand why it's being done, but it's causing problems. If I explain what the problems are, so we've got a number of, in Southeast London, particularly in Lewisham, number of videos on the social media. I think Lewisham is one of the areas that's being targeted for this strategy in that sense because of the number of violent crimes that have occurred there. But of course, the initial bit of publicity hasn't really continued in terms of briefing to the community what we're trying to do and sending some of those messages. So there is a degree of anger, a perception of excessive behaviour by police officers in terms of the strategy, and of course the issues of a real sort of, we're back to those days where I know the Met's worked hard in generating trust amongst BAME communities, but back to where people are very suspicious. They're very suspicious, they're not trusting of authorities and feel that they're under threat. Now, somehow the communication bit has gone wrong, and I'm sure, well, not gone wrong, but maybe started, but because of the events in America, because of COVID-19 and the background of that, there's something that's not quite gelling right, and there is a degree of anger in Lewisham about some of the police tactics that are taking place. Could you comment on that and see what you think we could do to retrieve that? Because it is an essential strategy if we're going to tackle violence in our communities.
Thank you, Len. Chair, if it's okay with you, I might just make a slightly broader comment to start with about the events in America and
Yep.
and you know how we are seeing things, if I could put it that way, and then move into the violence suppression units themselves. But I've heard every word you've said, Len, and my colleagues will have too, and we will obviously be pursuing better communications as required in the future. Like everybody, we have been appalled by the images we saw of George Floyd and the way he apparently lost his life. And we know that justice and accountability must follow and will follow, I'm sure. We're also horrified sitting here in London as police people at the violence and destruction that is going on in so many cities in the States as you know, the last few days, and our hearts go out to everybody who's been affected by that. I recognise also that feelings are running higher in London, partly as a consequence of viewing what is happening over there, and it comes at a difficult time for the city. The challenges everybody has had with lockdown, fears for their health, fears about jobs and about the economy. And I do want to reassure people in London, and through this committee if I can, that we will continue with our tradition of policing using minimum force necessary, working as closely as we possibly can with our communities. Met officers and staff are highly professional, they're very well trained, they're very restrained, and they're also very, very highly scrutinised, something we don't flinch from at all. But policing is complex and it is challenging, and you all know that because you have seen a lot of it and you've worked with us over the years, many of you. We're always learning, we're always improving, and as I say, we do welcome the scrutiny that comes from this group and in so many other ways. In the coming days and weeks, we will work even more closely with the public, with our communities. We'll be listening, we'll be responding, I hope, sensitively and effectively and quickly to concerns. We will respond fairly and with courage and with compassion. Our job is to prevent violence, of course it is. Our job is to keep people safe, to protect people in our communities and on our streets. And I know everybody wants to keep our streets safe and to keep them calm. And again, you know, I know, will be helping us with that. In terms of the violence suppression units, Len, I take it on the chin if you feel that the communication has dropped off. I don't know whether that's a very local issue or whether that is a broader issue, but I hear what you say. We did do a couple of weeks ago, and time is passing, if you like, very fast and very slowly at the moment, I know, some quite high-profile publicity about these new units, and they are on every BCU. We started growing them in January. So each of the 12 areas of London that we call a basic command unit has a violence suppression unit. And they are new, but they have a lot of people with a great deal of experience on them, combined with newer officers joining us. They supplement and complement the Violent Crime Task Force and the other units in London that are dedicated full-time to fighting violence, as well as all of the rest of the Met's efforts to bear down on violence. And they will be setting out to bring even more, and we've done enormous amounts of this in the last few weeks, violent criminals to justice, and they will be setting out to provide a visible presence, to be problem solving, to be deterring, to be preventing in those micro areas of London where we know that a very high, for whatever reason, a very high proportion of overall London or that sort of boroughs violence takes place. So these are sometimes, what you might call a town centre, a high street, for example. You will know where they are in your local areas, probably, perhaps, maybe not actually, but you'll know most of them. And we will be providing a high presence there, but that presence will be designed to protect people, to support people, and to work with people, and to stop violence, and if people do commit violence, to ensure that it is responded to and bringing people to justice. So we're on the same page. I know, Len. I'm, outside meeting, very happy to hear more about how we might communicate. As you say, of
Losing.
We lost you, Commissioner.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, yeah.
I'm sorry, maybe I turned my head. Apologies. Particularly against the background of people across London feeling fearful about various things for various different reasons. We must engage, listen, communicate even better than we ever have before, and we have to work together with people like you. So thank you for the comment.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, one more question from me, Commissioner, before I hand over to Assemblymember Hall. This committee is also obviously concerned about the welfare of police officers out there on the streets. How many officers have been assaulted by suspects utilizing COVID-19 as a weapon?
So if I look at the figures between the 20th of March and the 31st of May, we have had over 900 incidents of assault on our staff and officers overall. Of those, there are 100 in which spitting or coughing, and COVID being, part of that, has been part of that assault. There are other also spitting offences where there's been no mention of COVID, but it is still obviously a horrible thing to do to somebody, whoever. In this instance, a police officer or a member of police staff. So of the 100 where very specifically there's been a threat of COVID and a spit or a cough, we have charged 83. Of those, a number have come to trial. 14 have come to trial. 13 had a custodial sentence, which I think does underline the fact that the courts are taking these horrible offences very seriously.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner, for that information. And clearly that's not acceptable at all. Can I now hand over to Assemblymember Hall?
Good morning, Commissioner. I start by saying I'm very sorry that your officers have had all of those attacks. It's absolutely disgraceful, and I'm sure the whole committee agrees with that. Dreadful. Can I ask you, please, about policing of demonstrations and large gatherings, and in fact smaller gatherings? Some of the protests, such as the one in Trafalgar Square, seems to have been allowed to go ahead, and they were clearly not social distancing in any way. But we, or the police, managed to stop the one in Hyde Park where they were demonstrating. Can you explain to me why one goes ahead and the others didn't, when we're just not getting any social distancing in some of these demonstrations at all?
Thank you. Well, policing protest, as you know, is a very, very challenging and sometimes delicate balance. Clearly, over the period that we've had the COVID restrictions, a gathering, we've had three separate, well, no, we're on our fourth now, a separate set of regulations, restrictions, if you like. But at each point, gatherings of numbers of people, now six, more than six, is against the restrictions. And you will have seen that in the protest at, which you referred to at Trafalgar Square, which was a large number of people, thousands of people, probably ended up with about 3,000 people, and moved towards the US Embassy and then went elsewhere. Actually, we did do what we do, which is engage, talk to people, advise them, and eventually move to, if they won't comply with the restrictions, move to some enforcement notices or indeed, in some instances, arrests. And you'll have seen, even in that Trafalgar Square protest, that did happen. But if you put yourself in the shoes of a public order commander dealing with a protest which has come almost from nowhere, which has no organizer, nobody you can speak to, nobody will engage with you, nobody will plan with you or anything at all, as we've had with those, then you have to make some judgments at the time, in the moment, about what is the best thing to do. And judgments have been made that actually people are out in such numbers, feeling so strongly and refusing to disperse when asked, that the officers have formed the view that if they were to try at that stage, with those sorts of numbers, to enforce en masse, we would probably have ended up with very serious disorder and a bad situation, a difficult situation, challenging situation for everybody, turning into a violent situation. So these are the sorts of risks that public order commanders have.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner.
Hang on, I haven't finished.
Sometimes in conflict.
Okay, sorry, go on, Susan. Very quickly, Susan, do you want to come in and then, yeah.
Okay.
It's all right. Sorry, Commissioner, you froze for a bit there. Does the same apply to that rave that involved hundreds and hundreds of people that was allowed to go on? The police arrived there, I think, at 9, and the rave went on till about 1:30 in the morning. That was advertised a lot on the media, and people were wondering what was going on there.
So I wonder if we've had a number. Actually, London has been remarkably free of what we call unlicensed music events until the last few days, whereas some other cities in the country have had a number of those. We have had very, very few, and we have been really good at getting intelligence before they happen and being able to close them down before they get big, such as they have been. We had one at the weekend where it was very large before we even knew about it, and we worked really closely with the people in the local community and event to stop any more arriving, and when it was safe to do so, to disperse those people in an effective manner. And we will always try to stop an unlicensed music event before it starts, and we will always then, if somebody gets ahead of us, we will have to take the safety of the local community and everybody involved into account as to how we then police it. We'll try and stop other people arriving, we'll try and disperse it and close it down as quickly as possible. That's what I think they did on that occasion, and that's what we would do in the future. So But I think what you're also going to, perhaps there, Council, is that, again, in some of these events that they've seen in other cities around the country, and we've seen over the weekend with that one, people not socially distanced at all, people not really recognising the risks of being in a confined space. And so what I would say to any member of the public who is finding themselves in a crowd or a group, for whatever reason, is you must, obviously think about your safety and the safety of others in the context of social distancing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you, what would you say, because there are some communities that are in more danger than others of this COVID wretched virus. What would you say to people from communities that are really in danger, that are going to these various events? What message would you send them?
So the first thing I would say to all communities in London is that I really understand, as the Commissioner has said as well, the strength and the depth of the feeling of hurt because of the death of George Floyd. And that is incredibly important, that we stand in solidarity with those that feel so strongly because of what has happened in America and the continuing events in America. In terms of the protests, we've been really clear. People have the right and understand their fury and indignation of the events that's happened. And they have the right to protest, and there's a really difficult balance. I think the Commissioner's talked about the individual judgments of officers who have got to make decisions on the day, in the minute, and in fast time. What I would say to people that I understand your fury, I understand your anger, as does the Mayor, but please be safe. Don't forget, COVID is still out there. It is still we are still in a pandemic. Be safe and keep to the regulations and make sure that you social distance.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Chairman.
you. Okay, if I can now bring in Assembly Member Sean Berry to ask questions on fixed penalty notices for COVID regulation breaches. Sean.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, Commissioner, I know we've had private briefings where we've asked you for data about the fixed penalty notices, and I think we've written to you as well. So, the data that's been released today is the first we've seen of the final numbers of data of fixed penalty notices and arrests being made, and also the first we've seen of a demographic breakdown. So I just wanted to get, while we're in the meeting in public, get some clarity and make sure that we discuss that data. Your press release issued this morning and the report that was issued this morning, but which is dated the 28th of May, outlines that you've issued 973 fixed penalty notices and have made 36 arrests for breaches of the regulations alone, and a higher number of arrests for wider offences that also go alongside breaches of the data. You've released demographic data, and obviously at this time we're all particularly interested in ethnicity, and the demographic data shows that compared with the proportion of the population, black Londoners have been over twice as likely to be issued with a fixed penalty notice. They've had 26% of the fines issued, and they're only 12% of the population. And on arrests, there's an even higher disproportion. 2.58 is the ratio, 31% of arrests versus, again, 12% of the population. So I just wanted to make sure that we discuss that data. And just to check, I mean, you said before that there are a relatively small number of fixed penalty notices being issued. I think that's borne out by national data that Liberty have released. London, in proportion to its population, there are lower numbers. There's some signs that other forces have even higher disproportionality in terms of ethnicity too. But given this is the first we've seen of this data, have you been monitoring this data very closely and feeding back to officers cautions and guidance on avoiding this disproportionality, and doing anything in terms of, say, training to try and bring this down? Because it is evident in the data now, and we will want to be continuing to scrutinise this and ask you questions about it, not just in terms of acknowledging that there is the disproportionality, but what you're doing to bring that down.
Thank you very much. To go back to our general approach, as you know, in relation to the restrictions, we always engage, spend a lot of time engaging with people, explaining the restrictions, encouraging people, advising, cajoling, wanting people to comply, and using common sense and discretion, and only enforcing where the officer believes they must. And you said low volume. It isn't just per head of population it's low. In my view, Tom, it is very, very low, full stop. We are, I think, probably the 4th or 5th lowest per head of population in the country. That's an interesting point. But when you look at the practically minuscule number of notices, in my view, and less than 1 arrest a day in the whole of London, when we've had a total change in the law, a completely new set of things for the public and the officers to get their heads around. The vast majority of these notices and arrests, as you know, were in the first few weeks when it was very hot. And millions of encounters between officers and the public about the restrictions. I would say this is just a very low number, full stop. We've had thousands more officers on the street because of less crime, and we're growing. Every hour, there have been many more officers out there. I'm sure you've seen that. And yes, far fewer members of the public as well. But we've been actively policing, and we have been trying to bear down on violent crime. We have been policing in the areas where we know there's a high footfall, where there are many people out and about, and in the areas where we think there could be breaches, like the central London parks near where I am now, the South Bank near where I am now, but also in the areas of high violent crime. And you'll see that the large proportion of the arrests have been when COVID has been part of something else. So I'm not going to paint the picture for you, but you can imagine the sort of circumstances I think that the officers are dealing with when they've ended up enforcing in this way. But you'll see that it has reduced hugely latterly. Now, the disproportionality, as you call it, such as it is, and I don't want to sort of say it's not there, there is an apparent disproportionality there, but it is very much in line with other disproportionality that we see, which, obviously overall, nobody is happy that, for example, our Black and minority ethnic friends and family and colleagues are subject to far higher levels of victimization. Nobody is happy that there are lots of differences in society in that way, and nobody is happy, I suppose, overall, that when the police are enforcing the law, they often, in this time in our history, are coming into contact with, people in different ways across society. So I appreciate that this is an important issue in some ways, but I really, the whole issue, of course, of fairness and of equality and what's been happening to our BME community is enormously important. But I don't see, I'm afraid, this data here as extremely either surprising or something that people should get.
Okay.
Look at it in context. The context is less than 2,000 tickets, a very small number of arrests.
Okay, so my question before was what are you doing about it? And I think one of the things that's clear in the data is you said, there's engagement, and then if it crosses a certain threshold, then there is a fine. Potentially another threshold is whether or not somebody is arrested. And it's quite clear that in each stage, there is a disproportionality towards Black Londoners. And there are cases that we've seen that have been shared on social media where you can sort of see what's going on here, that the engagement doesn't work out as well because potentially the officers do not have the same attitude towards Black Londoners as they do to other Londoners. And my question was, what are you doing about this? You can see how unconscious biases, for example, could lead towards those thresholds being crossed more often for Black people. And so are you taking advantage of the time that you have to do the proactive policing you've described to us? Are you taking advantage of that leeway to do more training, to ask officers to pay attention to their biases when they're engaging in this work? That was my question before. What are you doing about it?
So I do not accept all your premises. Having said that, absolutely, we have been saying to our people engage, explain, be friendly, be positive. I've been out on the streets a lot. I have seen nothing but officers, even with people who approach them in quite an aggressive fashion, for whatever reason, and I'm not here necessarily at all talking about people from minority communities, but they are incredibly restrained in the main. They are extraordinarily friendly. That's what we've been saying. We've been saying this is a horrible time for the city. Do not, do anything other than try and help people to understand the restrictions and help them to comply and keep themselves and other people safe. And that applies to everybody. We have absolutely said you need to be in certain violent crime hotspots. We've said you need to police sensitively. We've said you need to be careful. They are, well trained anyway. I have not gone back to them and said, if this is the question a month ago, I am concerned about this disproportionality. Please stop acting in this manner, which will lead to disproportionality, because I don't see that as an issue that it's appropriate to do this about. We have been retraining officers. We haven't stopped training. We have, of course, been talking about how people may be feeling from a variety of different communities, and even more so in the last few days. Of course we have. But I have not, and I would not, and I wouldn't in retrospect either, do what you have suggested.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I'm slightly unsatisfied at the lack of acknowledgement that there are unconscious biases, but also I want to give way to Assemblymember Arnold, who's had a hand up for a while, so I'll leave it there for a moment.
Thank you. Assemblymember Arnold, and then Assemblymember Whittle. Yeah.
Yes, Chair, I do want to come in, and good morning to everyone. And can I just start by saying that, like us all, we welcome the decrease in crime, and we absolutely stand fast in our support of the Met's finest. However, there are issues that have to be addressed, and they have to be addressed when they are at the, if you like, starting point, when I would say to you they are in small numbers, because if they are not addressed, then what happens is that they grow, they take over, and we can never forget the Met's history in its relationship with the BAME community. That is at the forefront of the thoughts of every grandparent, every parent, and now third generation youngster, the relationship with the police service. So when you read, and when I am contacted, and I've had numerous numbers of pieces of casework saying, have we returned to a time of sus? What is happening? Is there a policy of racial profiling? How is the Mayor addressing unconscious bias? That is where we are. Now, it may be small numbers, but it is disproportionate to what we would expect. So therefore, there is an issue. So if you cannot answer or say anything more than you've said, Commissioner, I do want to say to you that we're going to have to come back and have another conversation about this in a much more thorough way, because what you've said so far is not something that I can go back to those who have contacted me and say, I am not going to go back and say the Met Commissioner feels the numbers are small and is in a way content with the situation as it is, because I certainly am not content, and the people are calling me are not content. I share my colleagues Sean Berry's concerns. Thank you.
But, if I could just respond, I'm really happy to continue this conversation. I absolutely am, in whatever format, wherever. I started by acknowledging just how strongly people are feeling about all kinds of things, just how fearful people are, how cross some people are about various things. I started acknowledging that, by acknowledging the amount of capacity we have had and the fact that we've had many officers out on the street. I remain proud of what they have been doing. I absolutely do. But of course, Jeanette, I recognise the history that we're talking about here overall. And that's why we absolutely have been saying to them, be careful, be sensitive, think about this. Think about how you're working with people. That's why they've adopted, in my view, the very low-key and friendly approach. If we go back 10 or 12 weeks, people were wondering how on earth this would work and whether the public would just, start, being terribly angry very quickly by the way they were being policed. And we've been, I think, brilliant collectively at avoiding that. People were worrying about disorder, they were worrying about looting. We've been brilliant collectively at keeping London overall safe and calm in extraordinary circumstances. But I absolutely acknowledge what you are saying. One part of this is the officers have been in high crime, high violent crime areas, and they have been looking for people that they know to be prolific knife carriers, to be violent offenders. And when they see, for example, I'm not talking about ethnicity here, but when the restrictions say you can't have more than 2 people or then 3, and you've got 4 boys in a car, that will who clearly don't come from the same household, that will immediately take them to think about talking to those people. Now, we've said again and again, be sensitive, be careful, and I think they have been. But I have not been going back to them. I have to be honest, I haven't gone back to them and say, think about your unconscious bias. I've said, let's keep things calm, let's do our work really professionally, let's be careful. And when things go wrong, inverted commas, respond to it really well and carefully, which I think we have.
Okay, right.
But I absolutely take your point about the history, Jeanette. I do.
Okay, I do want to move on, Assemblyman Arnold. I think later on we might have questions of a similar nature in the section on stop and search. Assemblyman Whittle, do you still want to come in? No. Okay. Can I then move to the next question from Assemblyman Dismore? Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, the government's recently changed the rules for lockdown. Did they issue any extra guidance to the police? And do you feel that the guidance to the police and the public has been clear enough so people know what they can and can't do? And equally, your officers know what the public should and shouldn't do and what they can do in terms of enforcement if necessary?
Thank you. Well, both I and other colleagues in the MAT have been able to have very regular conversations with the government and with the Home Office in particular, of course, and that includes our lawyers and others very heavily engaged with helping to think through how any changes in regulations could impact on us as a professional advice from police officers about the law and how it might work. We all recognise that this is both a huge change, set of changes, and it's continuously changed, and that the restrictions can be quite hard for people to understand. And we've recognised that from the beginning, which is why we have been so restrained in our use of the powers. On each occasion, the National Police Chiefs Council, working closely with the Met and the College of Policing, have tried to get out to the officers as quickly as possible what the regulation change means and how we think it should be policed and applied. And some aspects have always been easier and more obvious than others. So, for example, if people have been doing things in a garden or a private space, clearly both that might be unsafe and potentially even against the restrictions, that is something where we would think carefully and twice before we started going in to try and find out more about the background and the history and why the people are there in those circumstances. So that's just one example. I think on occasion the public have struggled to understand some aspects, not surprisingly. And it's taken the officers on each change, some hard work to get their heads around what are the key issues. But the key issues, I think, are clear. And officers do understand those. And we have put out, I've got one here, every time a sort of 2-page advice notice to them, which has been in the public domain as well, explaining the change in restrictions. And I'm really proud of the way in which they have adapted and interpreted them.
Do you think the new rules are actually enforceable? Since the rules changed, has there been a fall off in the enforcement arrangements? You gave us, we've had the numbers from before, but I get the impression that there's been a lot less going on, and certainly as far as the public is concerned, as we've seen from pictures on the TV and other reports, there are crowds all over the place, apart from the demonstrations, where people seem to be doing what they want. I mean, apparently there was quite a big incident in in Camden last night at Parliament Hill with a gang of 500 people getting together. So what I'm concerned about is whether the public actually know. And I saw that the Police Federation previously warned against changing the rules without having clear guidance and messaging in place for the public and the police on what the changes mean in practice. And also the Chief Superintendents Association issued a very similar message about gaps between government guidance and the law. So I also asked you whether the government have actually issued any guidance, or is it only what you've come up with yourselves?
No, there has been government guidance throughout, and each time the regulations have changed, the guidance has changed as well. We can only enforce the restrictions and the regulations. So, for example, people have assumed that we could enforce something about social distancing. We've never been able to do that. That's not something that we can enforce. We could advise, just as any responsible person would, but we can't actually enforce. So there's been, of course, there's been a difference between the regulations and their interpretation in law, which is what we deal with in enforcement terms, the guidance which has come from the government. Then our advice to our officers needs to be complementary to both of those and focus on the regulations. And then, of course, there's people's interpretation, what they've heard and what they've understood. And as each time it has changed, I accept, I think, your premise, which is that it has depended more on people being socially responsible and doing the right thing than it has on enforcement. And you will see, yes, we have not been enforcing using the powers of fixed penalty notice and arrests so much latterly. And I do agree with you. It felt to me rather at the weekend as though a lot of people were out and about. The vast majority of them, of course, you're allowed to be outside now, absolutely. The vast majority of them were observing social distancing and being sensible, but some weren't. And I agree that's a challenge. And so the message we all need to give is enjoy the outside, enjoy exercise appropriately, but keep yourself and other people safe.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I mean, I'd also like to ask you whether you think, I think I'd probably better put this question to Sophie rather than to you, but what do you think the impact of the Cummings affair has been on people's attitudes to all this? I mean, are they simply thinking, oh, well, there's one law for them, one law for us, and we can make our own rules up now?
I think, I mean, in general, over the course of this crisis, and this pandemic, I think the police have, and especially the Metropolitan Police, have done an extraordinarily good job in really difficult circumstances. And those difficult circumstances is about the complexity and the density of London, and that we all know about, but also the difficult circumstances of the way in which the regulations have been changed through briefings and headlines before they're actually put in place and before guidance has come through. The Federation were right when it's really difficult for officers to be able to make individual judgments on the ground, when the guidance, there's briefings happening that restrictions are being lifted, but they haven't yet been lifted. And that's happened on a number of occasions during the course of this crisis. I think that officers have had to be, they have been, for the most part, incredibly good in the judgments that they are making, and actually the number of FPNs that we've had over the course of this pandemic have been relatively small compared to the size of the population and the density of London and the complexity of London. I mean, in terms of what's happened, of the high-profile people who have flouted the rules, and they have flouted the rules, it has had a detrimental impact on people's ability, and what the clear messages that need to go through about keeping to the restrictions, keeping to the regulations, and remembering that all the rules and all the regulations apply to everybody equally. And I think that when that is flouted, that has a detrimental impact, and it really needs to be properly dealt with.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I really got to move on. Questions on stop and search. Assemblymember Arnold.
Yes, Chair, thank you. To the Commissioner, well, let's have an opening question. Let's look at the balance. Firstly, let's look at the balance. Is it right that there is that rate of disproportionality between black and minority ethnic Londoners and the rest of the population of London who are being stopped and searched by your officers? We've lost volume.
My apologies, everybody. Stop and search is a very important power. It needs, and I believe is, to be used obviously carefully, lawfully, and when there are grounds under the law, intelligence-led, and that's exactly what the officers have been doing. And as I say, I believe actually we have been having overall in our proactivity, which includes stop and search, record successes against violent criminals in the last several weeks. I could give you some extraordinary examples. I won't bore you, Jeanette, but I'm happy to write to you afterwards with extraordinary examples of things that have come from stop and search in terms of arrests and seizures of violent people and with large quantities of drugs or firearms or knives. That has been happening day after day after day. We have done against probably what people might have expected, remaining a very resilient service, very healthy service overall. And as I've said, having some opportunities to redeploy people because of the change in demand on the Met. We have been doing, I think this month, April, if I look at April, we did actually over 30,000 stop and searches. I am not asking for that to go up and up and up, far from it. I'm asking for it to be targeted, as I believe it is, to be designed to suppress violence and catch violent criminals and to result in a, we need it to be resulting in a good yield of positive outcomes. When you look at the positive outcomes that we have had, actually, the same still applies, which is that, if I can put it this way, for every 100 white men stopped and searched, you get a percentage of positive outcomes. It is almost exactly the same for black men or Asian men. It doesn't vary very much at all. And I believe that shows what I believe to be true, which is that the officers are actually doing the job on the basis of grounds. They're doing it fairly, they're doing it lawfully, and they are doing the right thing. I do understand the point you're making in terms of perception, but I'm afraid I take it back to this is tied up with a whole set of other complex issues about, for example, the horrific victimization of young black men, featuring as victims in violent crime statistics, and the requirement for us as the police to be in the areas where violence is happening and protecting our youngsters and protecting our public there.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Commissioner. And again, and it always has to be said by somebody like me, who's actually raising issues that have been brought to them by BAME communities, is that I don't know any black person who would not support the police in their work when it is evidence-led, because it is the very people, BAME people, who need the police when they are under attack. So there is no issue here about there being a bias within a community in terms of them being hostile with the police. There is no such thing. What there is, though, and this is what we will continue to look at, is when we look at the figures, we have to be asking a question about the intelligence that officers are using. Because if you look, and an example of a young man called Shmo, I'm sure I'm misstating his name, and he's in the public domain, and he's telling his story. Mr. Lewis was was part of a volunteer group delivering aid during COVID. He was the only one that was stopped. The only outstanding factor was he was a young black man. Now, how do you deal with that? How can that be intelligence-led? What was the added factor that was going on there? And so I would ask you to look at the data, which we haven't had time, whatever has been sent to us at the last moment, we haven't had adequate time to look at, to say, are you looking at individual locations? Are you looking at individual officers' reports? because we are all subject to biases, but in the
Yeah.
police force, those unconscious biases, those prejudices have got to be identified and dealt with ASAP.
Thank you.
Can I ask your response for that?
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, just to be clear, there's no power of stop and search under the COVID restrictions. They are two separate things. As I said, we've had thousands of officers out on the street, most of them spending most of their time just talking to people in a very friendly manner. But on occasion, some of them, intelligence-led, doing a stop and search. I can't possibly comment on the individual case you talk about. You know, I see why it raises a question. As you know, we're more scrutinised, I suspect, than any other police service in the world. Everybody has their body-worn video. Nowadays, most people are being filmed when they're doing a stop and search by somebody on a mobile phone. If somebody wishes to complain about that, then they should. We have a very low number of complaints, but I would encourage people to complain if they feel that it has been unfair or they don't understand why it happened or why them. We are always seeking to improve people's confidence in our doing this without bias, confidence in our professionalism in doing it, and improve people's understanding of their rights and what they should do if they feel that it's been inappropriate. But the inference of what you're saying, of course, if you know, is something that seems to be, you know, unfair and random, that is the exact opposite of what I believe the officers are doing and what I want our Met to be doing. And all the leaders here would say the same, and I think my colleagues would say the same. We don't want to be or even be seen as unfair, and we are not acting randomly. We are acting in an intelligent and thoughtful fashion. And yes, we look all the time at individual stop and search slips and what we're doing in particular areas all the time. Every day, borough commanders will be thinking about that sort of thing. Please use one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm conscious of the time. Does anyone else, any other members want to come in, or I'll move to the next section?
I'm on section 60, Unmesh.
Yeah. Very quickly, Andrew. We are ready. Yeah. So,
Commissioner, I just want to ask about section 60 and whether there's been an increase in use of section 60. Certainly in Camden, there seem to have been an awful lot very recently. And the other concern I have is not just the scale of them, obviously some of them stretch over borough boundaries, but also the authorisations for section 60 have now been taken by acting inspectors, in other words, substantive sergeants. And I am concerned that they are getting the proper consideration and the orders are being made at a sufficiently competent level. And that's not to be derogatory about the sergeants, but it does seem to me a bit peculiar that acting sergeants are making such important decisions affecting so many people.
Apologies, Andrew, for looking away as you were speaking. I was looking for my latest section 60 figures. I haven't got them right at my fingertips. Of course, I can give them to you in due course. I don't think there's been a substantial increase. No, in fact, overall in the COVID period, there has definitely not. However, we have done some, and we've done some throughout. And that is because, and it slightly links with what we've been talking about already, the gang nominals, and we may come to this, have not been as restricted as other people. They have been out on the streets. They have been showing tensions. They have, on occasion, been fighting. And when we get intelligence that says two gangs are going to meet and fight, which we can see sometimes very plainly in social media or from sources, then we will respond to that. If a young boy has been stabbed, and sadly we've had some of those, and we fear there's going to be reprisals, then we will put a section 60 in place if it is justified. Yes, it's made in the first instance by an inspector. I take the point they might not all be, you know, long-term substantive inspectors. They're all reviewed very quickly by the superintendent, either the local or the on-duty, and then seen by the commander who's on call, NPCC officer who's on call for the day. So I am satisfied that they get a lot of scrutiny, and colleagues here are very welcome to look at how we scrutinise them, not just on the day, but going forward, how we review them and then how we look at them in the round. There's something, it's a power we absolutely don't want to be overusing, but we will use where we feel we need to keep the broader public and other young people, it's usually involving youngsters, safe in the aftermath of or in the height of a gang tension.
So when the section 60 order is made, it comes out in the name of the acting inspector.
Yeah.
Does the order take effect when the acting inspector says it, or after it's been scrutinised by the commander? And if the latter, how long does it take between wanting one and one actually coming into effect?
So it's the former. The legislation absolutely allows, and guidance now allows an inspector, and we do encourage inspectors to make fast decisions. They're very responsible people. They're in charge of policing of the whole borough for a 12-hour or 8-hour period, and they have lots of difficult and challenging things to deal with. If you've ever spent time with any of them, you can see it's one of the hardest jobs in the Met. They're doing it 24/7, but they have to look at their context. They have to talk to guidance from their perspectives, from the Violent Crime Task Force and others, and they'll look at the intelligence, and they will decide what is proportionate and what is going to keep other people safe. And then they'll take it off as soon as it needs to be taken off. And you'll often see them being taken off quite quickly. And it's also the case that quite often I get a call saying, why haven't you put a Section 60 in, Commissioner? From lots of very powerful people on occasion. And I'll say, because the intelligence doesn't justify it. Although something horrible has happened there, we don't expect any reprisals. This is, I've mentioned 2 layers of scrutiny. There's actually another one, which is the Chief Inspector sitting in the control room at Lambeth, as it happens. He's in charge overall for sort of daily, minute-by-minute stuff in London, knowing when it needs to be escalated or gripped in a different way. They also look at it. So within a matter of hours, and sometimes minutes, 3 senior officers would have looked at that Section 60 to see whether it is proportionate and justified, and whether it needs to be extended or in time or geography, or perhaps sometimes it's scaled back quickly.
Can we have a breakdown borough by borough, do you think, over the period of the COVID crisis? I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm sure we can do that. I mean, we do publish it regularly, and as I say, there's a very strong scrutiny framework in management terms, which would be very welcome to be taken through by Jane Connors, our violence lead, at some stage, if you would like.
Thank you, Commissioner. The last set of questions in this section, it is an important issue. Assembly Hall, but can we just bear in mind the time, the use of tasers?
Yes, okay. I think because of time, Commissioner, could you send us whatever data you've got regarding the use of tasers over the lockdown period? And just something, can you answer now, have the Met issued any revised guidance on the use of tasers in the light of the Haringey incident?
I'm sure we'll have to do a little bit of analysis of that, but it won't take us too long. It would a special request, absolutely. We will look at taser use. There certainly has been taser usage during this time period, and we have continued to assess and reassess everything to do with our training, which has also continued. As you know, we're in the middle of an uplift, and our guidance to our officers. I believe some of you would have seen the training. I do believe it is good training, but we're always seeking to see if there's any, from all sorts of incidents, we seek to see whether there's anything else we should tell people about how to assess situations. Officers using taser are fully aware of the responsibility they have, and as you know, unlike some forces, I only have slightly more experienced officers using taser. They are also taken through a whole series of dynamic scenarios. I'm not going to comment on the Haringey incident specifically. As you know, that is, I think what we're referring to is something which is now subject to an independent officer police conduct investigation, which is obviously the right thing. We have there a young man who has been seriously injured as a result of the tasering, and obviously we've reached out to him and his family, but the IOPC will do an investigation of that to see A, what the lessons are to be learned, if any, and B, whether there has been any conduct issues. But we're always seeking to improve as a result of anything that goes on. Simply take it back to, officers are making extremely fast decisions in very dynamic circumstances. They are, taught how to assess a huge range of information that's coming into them from all angles. It's a hard thing to do. And sometimes they can't predict exactly what will be the result of the tasering.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just talking of the IOPC, Deputy Mayor, its Director General, Michael Lockwood, recently released a statement saying that he felt tasers being used, quote, disproportionately, unquote, on people from a BME background. and those with mental health issues. Also, the Police Commissioners Association lead on use of force has said that the police's use of taser needs closer scrutiny. Do you agree with this?
So on the latter, Umesh, if I heard you right,
I was
you were
asking,
referring
sorry,
to
Commissioner, you
one-
can come in, and then Deputy Mayor. Go on, Commissioner.
Oh, sorry.
Go on, Commissioner.
I'm so sorry. On the latter, if I heard you right, and you were breaking up a little bit for me, you were talking about one of the members of the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners, just one, who made a comment. And then if you look later, you'll see that the other, I think the association, or certainly many other commissioners, distanced themselves from that comment. But apologies, because I may have misheard what you were saying there. We look at taser along with other uses of force all the time and scrutinise it carefully. The Deputy Mayor can talk about the conversations that she and I have very regularly about the use of force data and what it is telling us. And of course, within that conversation, we talk about disproportionality. I recognise that it is something that causes concern in communities, and we are very careful about our use of taser. We've been very careful about the rollout of it. It's an excellent piece of equipment. It has saved the lives of countless members of the public and suspects, if I can put it that way, and potentially police officers over the last several years. And we are determined to continue using it and having more officers trained to keep the public safe, but to use it in a way that is appropriate and, as far as we possibly can, feels appropriate for the public as well. But Sophie will want to comment on this, I'm sure.
Deputy Mayor.
Thanks a lot. I mean, in terms of, the Commissioner's absolutely right, in terms of the use of force and tasers incredibly well scrutinised, and is actually one of the uses of force which can be tracked from the moment it's taken out of the holster to the red dotting to the actual tasering of an individual. And that is something that we look at and that we, through our oversight board, which are published as well, we look at those figures and we interrogate those figures. And you can see within that there are more black individuals who are tasered than others. What we try to get underneath the figures is the reasons for that and what is happening there, and there is a lot of scrutiny there. And it's right that the IOPC is looking into the individual incident in Haringey, which obviously, as the Commissioner has said, we can't comment on. Can I just say, in terms of, it's not just scrutiny of taser that's incredibly important, it's the scrutiny of the stop and search as well as the Section 60s and the use of force. In terms of Assembly Member Arnold's questions in relation to really strong concerns that are coming out of the community, not just during COVID and not just after George Floyd's death, but have been coming out of the community throughout my time as Deputy Mayor, that is something that we take incredibly seriously, needs to be properly scrutinised. And where there are occasions where police officers, and I know the Commissioner agrees with me in this and takes it incredibly seriously, where there are occasions where police officers are, the members of the public think that police officers have not had the proper grounds for a stop and search or are using what they appear to be, could be, or appears to be excessive force, it does have to be properly scrutinised, looked at properly and dealt with properly and with due process, whether that be the IOPC or through the Met's internal processes itself. And what's really important is not that just it is properly looked at, is that is then communicated to the community and to those who are most affected. And I think that's where sometimes it does break down, that communication. But I also know that the Met take, for every incident that has been passed to them, either by members of the public or by ourselves or by MOPAC, and we do send incidents over, that there are local community engagement plans put in place, and the Met are reaching out locally to the communities. Now, then I'm really happy to have a conversation with you, Jeanette, after this. If that isn't strong enough or good enough, we need to improve it, because this is so important, because we need to have the right balance as a community, having confidence in the use of the powers, and police officers having confidence to use the powers, because we are, as the Commissioner has set out, and we all know, those powers are a really useful tool in tackling violence, and we need to have the community's consent for the powers to be used and for police officers to feel confident to use them as well.
Thank you. Okay, moving on now to the next section, drug supply. Sorry,
Chair. Could I just come back in with 2 points of information? Firstly, to Andrew, I've found the Section 60 figures. We've had 39 Sorry, I'm sorry. Is that the COVID thing? That's not the COVID thing. Okay, 39 section 60s, of which, and that's a 40% decrease, which is, not a surprise to me. It's in line with many other things, actually. And in relation to Taser, just to say, as you know, there's a National Officer Safety Review going on. Disproportionality is being taken into account in that. And there's some complex issues behind this. As Sophie has said, we take it very seriously.
Yeah.
The disproportionality is quite similar in use of force across the board, and similar, of course, to arrest statistics and other issues as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you. Moving on to the next section, Assembly Member O'Connell, drug supply during the crisis.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, Commissioner and Deputy Mayor. I'd like to support many of the comments from my colleagues earlier, but I'd like to turn, and some of these points have been covered, but there is a connection, slightly more positive note on the violence suppression units. And I'd refer to an excellent article in The Observer, followed up by The Guardian on Monday, when their journalists joined Croydon teams. And a very positive outcome of that experience, very much accented on reclaiming streets and work in actual microbeats, which is a concept I wasn't aware of. So the question lines I've got at the moment, particularly for you, Commissioner, is linked to that, but particularly around drug supply. Now, clearly, during this period, all businesses have been suppressed, and there's no difference within the drug supply business on our streets. So first of all, Commissioner, I'd like to ask you, in relation to the suppression that officers have been embarking upon, can you confirm the sort of results that have yielded over these last 10 weeks from this new strategy?
Thank you very much, yes. So we have continued with our focus on drugs and violence. There's an undeniable link between the two. The drugs markets have been affected to some extent by the restrictions. It's been quite complex to work out exactly what's going on there, but broadly speaking, I think we would say that street prices have not varied very much. Maybe wholesale prices in certain drugs types in London have increased a bit, and in some parts, which is of course worrying, we have seen drugs purity getting worse, if you like. And also another change, which has particularly affected, I think, our most addicted people, some of whom, of course, are regularly on the streets and homeless. People who are dealing are asking for people to buy larger amounts, and therefore it costs more. And for some addicts who don't have any other source of income, finding the money can be very hard for that. So we've seen some change, definitely, in the time of COVID. But then the other big change that you've talked about, as you said, is firstly the violence suppression units, but also our work on the streets. And I mean, just as an example, in the last couple of days, we had a seizure of 212 kilograms of cocaine. This is just one case, and over £1 million. Looking down my list here, every week we're having seizures of kilograms and kilograms, most weeks sometimes tens of kilograms of drugs, and all of them with people arrested at the same time. So the point I make here is that we've been doing a lot of work against the higher level dealers, and very effectively as well, frequently recovering firearms. And of course, in the vast majority of those cases, we are able to move to a charge quickly. I'm happy to write with several other examples of that. If we turn to county lines, which we did some media about yesterday, again, we've continued with our efforts on that. And although we think we've seen probably something of a reduction of young people being trafficked up and down the country to conduct the county line with cash or drugs, there's been, we think, a bit of a reduction there, not complete. We have nevertheless gone on targeting the line holders, and the perhaps have seen the figures of the overlap between those involved in county lines and violence.
Yep.
So a recent analysis, 1,300 individuals in county lines involved in 2,000 violent offences that we know about, some of which are murders, lots of robberies, hundreds of weapons offences. So we've been going after the line holders, and in the last several months, just under one operation, and we've done many different ones, but under one operation, so called the Rochi, we've had 87 line holders and 183 charges. And it's a very effective and very efficient method that we have come up with, so that from the point of getting information about a county line holder through to arrest, we have an evidential package at the time of arrest, which we are very comfortable with, will result immediately in a charge. And the charge, they head off towards the court. The vast majority now pleading guilty as well, because the evidential package is so good. This is extremely disruptive to those individuals, a very efficient and effective way to deal with them. The line is closed. And so it goes on, Steve. We've been doing an enormous amount, and the local units have been highly present, and they have been targeting the knife carriers, the people who are out and about, dealing drugs usually, and involved in violence in a very local area as well.
Okay, thank you for that. And typically you anticipate the question around county lines, and I thank you very much for that. Yeah, certainly the feedback I've had, and I spoke only this morning to a leading member of the community, unnamed, is that the communication line between officers and the community in my patch has been, at the moment, good. And so I think that is to be reflected. But I think the next question is, with the lockdown being eased, and hopefully that will happen over coming weeks, etc., the gangs will have to, and the offenders will have a fresh opportunity to start moving their stockpiles around, and there will be a change of behaviours. It's going to be out on the streets. So whilst I commend the work of the suppression units, how are the officers and the team preparing themselves for perhaps a late summer surge of activity?
Well, as I say, we have locked up a very large number of people, and the dealers who are on the street have had to show themselves a bit more obviously. They haven't been able to exploit the children in the same way. They've been more present and more obvious because people stand out on an empty street, and we have been able to lock up a lot. And we've also, of course, been monitoring through our variety of intelligence sources how they are seeing things and the tensions that are playing out between them. And several great results where we have known that somebody was going along to kidnap somebody else or to stab somebody else, and we've been able to intervene and catch them at the right time. The micro work is designed to, as you say, according to the Observer article, take back particular areas focused on Croydon. As anyone who's been there will know those two strips of areas where really it's felt to the local shopkeepers and public going about their shopping and going to the bus station and whatnot as a place where the dealers are dominating and a place that has felt unsafe on many occasions for people, I think. So we're absolutely determined to keep up our presence, for example, in that area. And we have a lot of assets and a lot of knowledge and skills that we've built up over the last few weeks to be able to apply to the right people in the right places at the right time.
Okay. I mean, certainly I'm speaking for the businesses and community around the London Road area. I'm sure they very much welcome the activity. My last question is, you've mentioned very much that some serious characters have been taken off the streets, literally. You've been able to identify those people. There is an issue emerging about capacity in our courts. So with this increase in arrests and taking some serious criminals off the streets, is there sufficient court availability and capacity, from your understanding, to deal with those individuals, Commissioner?
So I think this is very challenging. Nick F. is the lead for National Police Chiefs Council, and as you know, one of my assistant commissioners. He's been leading the work with the Ministry of Justice and the whole of the criminal justice system, and of course working with City Hall as appropriate on this as well. There are very complex issues involving the magistrates' courts and different very complex issues involving the Crown Court. They both have, after initially closing to just a tiny trickle of business in a sense, they both have stepped up more latterly. And of course, we've all found, and you may want to turn to this, but different ways of dealing with video-enabled justice and whatnot. And we've worked more closely together than we ever have. But I am concerned, and I think all police chiefs and indeed people involved in the system are concerned about the backlogs that have been building and the ability of the system to clear those effectively. Justice delayed, justice denied. It is true, it's not good for witnesses and particularly victims who know that a bail date is a long way off for the offender, that they're not going to come to trial for a long time. And we're all deeply alert to this. At the moment, it's not clear quite how the backlogs will be reduced and how, in the Crown Court, for example, the serious offenders will be progressed quickly. Although most of our serious offenders, of course, are remanded in custody, there does come a time where, a judge may feel that it's just not right or fair for somebody to stay untried for a very, very, very long time. And that, of course, in the future could pose some risks as well. So I would say we're working as hard as we can. We're pushing others in the system as hard as we can. I know they're trying to come up with all their clever ideas about how to shift the backlogs, but it is of concern to us at the moment.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm sure our committee will continue to take an interest in that area. Thank you very much.
Steve, can I just say, in terms of the courts and the backlog of the courts, I think the Commissioner's absolutely right. It's a massive, it's a huge concern. There is a big backlog, obviously, for obvious reasons, that has now built up. And I've been working through the Associated Police and Crime Commissions that I lead on victims for, particularly about pressing the court service, the CPS, and the whole system to gear up to be able to get through the cases more quickly than it appears that they're going to be able to. And it would be really helpful if, actually, in terms of your role and Umesh maybe as chair, if we could write to press this, because it's across the piece for the police, communities and victims. It's a real problem, and it's going to be a real problem in the coming months, because the police have been really active during it, and it's been fantastic, the warrants that have been executed and the offenders that have been arrested. But if we can't get them through the system, it's going to be actually people's confidence in the system is going to fall, and it's going to be a real problem.
Thank you. And I'm sure the chair will be talking to us about that action. I would certainly support it. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor.
We'll take that point on board, Deputy Mayor. Thank you. Moving on to the next section, Domestic and Child Abuse, Assembly Member Lendual.
Okay, Commissioner, I'm going to concentrate on the domestic abuse, and my colleague would probably deal with the child abuse issues. Some of them overlap, of course, in areas of some cases of domestic abuse and violence. Look, pre-COVID, we know the mission, right? And we know the numbers, and we know there was the postcode lottery. So Steve House addressed this committee last year and talked about how he was tackling the issues around outcomes. And we know those outcomes aren't always judicial outcomes, but after every encounter where there's been a report of domestic abuse or violence, there has to be an outcome. Now, of course, COVID-19 has come up, and there have been some changes in the way police have worked, and I think that's to be welcomed. The real challenge for us is, are they sustainable? Is this a precursor for the Met reviewing? Is it using all the issues at its disposal in tackling this vicious, nasty crime and scourge in our society that's part of the wider violence strategy of the Met? So are we going to have some fresh thinking, building on terms of what's happening in COVID-19, or do we revert back to where we were? Because I think there were still problems. We can discuss that if you want.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for acknowledging all the hard work that's gone on, led by Sue Williams and with many other colleagues, working right across London with other agencies of the third sector, and of course with City Hall and the government. We have taken the opportunity to look at what we're doing in terms of domestic abuse. incidents, we have seen a small rise, slightly smaller in terms of the actual crimes recorded. But of course, as you know, we anticipate there could be other crimes taking place that we are not aware of at the moment, that people are unable to report. And we may have a surge afterwards, as has happened in some countries coming out of lockdown, but not all. And we're working as hard as we can to keep in touch where appropriate with both, victims and actually offenders, to try, even through the restrictions, to maximise the opportunity for victims to keep to work with us and minimise the opportunity for offending. We have seen a huge increase in the number of arrests and in the sanction detection rate, both substantially up. And I am delighted by that. So all the time I was talking about violent offenders before, that includes domestic abuse violent offenders. We've arrested a very, very large number of those and brought them, through the CPS to the beginning of the next stage of the justice system. We've also been using a wider range of, the legal powers that are available collectively. So we have used the DVDS much more, we've used the DVPNs much more, and the DVPOs much more. I know you're familiar with these, sorry to talk in the jargon then. So there have been big increases, and we want to build on that. Of course we do. And we want to build on throughout, building a stronger, more agile Met, and one which responds more effectively to the things that Londoners care about most, of which this is one. There's lots of lessons from this time period, and we're learning them together with colleagues, and we will do our level best, not, as you say, to go back to where we were on violent crime in general, or indeed domestic abuse. But we will need the help of other agencies and the public as we do that, and of this committee as well.
And of course, that help could come in the way around the way that there is still a reluctance, even though this is a difficult crime, and you can understand from a victim's point of view of wanting to talk to the police. But it seems to me one of the disparities is they're prepared to talk to others rather than talk to the police as they weigh up their options around what and their various circumstances and what to do. So I can get that. And of course, you're having those conversations with those other agencies, particularly the third sector, of how we can improve that and what we can. When you say we're learning the lessons of this particular period of time, will you be able to share that? So it may well be this national emergency with the virus is going to continue for some time, but it seems to me that we've got to start working about what the future looks like, if we can, and how we take those lessons and put those into substantial practice. I welcome the issues about the domestic violence protection notices. It was hit and miss before. I'm hoping we're seeing something a bit more concerted, but I'd welcome some data on that to be shared with the committee about this period of time. Not even though it's special, but it is about learning the lessons and about how we can take them forward. Can I just ask very quickly on the renewed focus of Operation Darkness Plus, just to remind those who may be watching this webcast, it's about tackling the most prolific of perpetuators of these crimes. Have we got any detailed information, and is that being handled by the violence suppression units you mentioned earlier, or is that still being left to the specialists? How is that being worked up and tasked? And can you share that with us and any outcomes that may have arisen during this period?
So more broadly, for everybody, Helen Ball is leading for the boards on how we do what we call our recovery and renewal work. We've never kept our eye off the long term. We've been working on our long-term projects and programs. We've been growing the Met. We've been doing everything we can to sustain the Met for the future, so that we're in a really fit way overall in 2021. But one of those things is learning the lessons, whether that's about digital working, whether that's about more intelligent use of information here or there, whether it's about bearing down on domestic abuse. So we will have a series of sort of commentaries on what we think we have learned during this period at quite a high level, I suppose, across the board. And absolutely happy in due course to share that with you, Sue Williams is constantly reviewing what is going on and what we are learning. In terms of the Dauntless type operations, the safeguarding teams have a plan for coming through the restrictions being eased, as do the other teams and as do the local BCUs. But they call upon fugitive units. Frequently we have those where they're, somebody who's been who is a prolific violent domestic abuser, often involved in other crime as well, who's gone to ground. We've been finding them, and we use the fugitive units to do that. And on occasions, of course, we will use either sort of other detectives or indeed the suppression units. I was out myself with one in your part of London the other day, and they were going out collectively to find and arrest a violent domestic abuser. The fact that people talk to other agencies sometimes ahead of us, absolutely, we understand, and we need to work as effectively as possible with them, and we need to raise people's confidence in talking directly to us as well. I would just point out, though, there does seem to be something of a London difference, that when you look at some of the people who've been most seriously injured or even killed, sadly, in what appear to be domestic, incidents, it is not uncommon for them never to have come to the notice of any single agency at all. And so one hears, of course, about these people who so horribly put up with 16 or 20 or what is the figure of, before they talk to anybody, and then, and the police might not be very close to the beginning of the queue of the people they do talk to. They might talk to their friend at work, they might talk to the person in the shop, the pharmacist or whoever, and we've been reaching out to all those people through employers, through shops and through local communities to say, talk to whoever. But some people who are victims of domestic abuse do not, COVID or no COVID, tell anyone, and that's a problem too. And I think it may be a London problem with people who are moving around a lot and not feeling, so engaged in parts of London with other parts of society. We need to tackle that.
I'm just going back to one of the other issues, and thank you for that answer. I'm going back particularly about response, and going back to the outcome issues, and knowing how important it is to impress upon those officers who are doing that instant response and the pressure they're under in carrying their caseloads. So if we can go back to the outcome issues, and I'm pleased there are more arrests, to be honest, because sometimes that needs to happen. But these other outcomes, where particularly children are involved, or issues that others, or follow-up issues, where we're saying, actually, I'm going to watch this now situation, but I'm going to come back or at the next shift and we're going to call on them. Is that really part of the wider Met strategy and some of those issues of where we try and embed a best practice approach around that? So when I come off the shift, no police officer should say, I attended a domestic abuse incident and there was no outcome. That can't be right. And I know that was what the worry and concern was last year, but have we really embedded it enough with our inspectors and with our response teams that that's really what they should be looking for? There has always got to be some outcome, even if it is, I'm going to ask someone to call on the individual just to see how it is on the next shift, or I'm going to do a referral around those issues. Are we clear about that bit in terms of preventative work or as a response? Is that appropriate? Is that possible? I think that was the aim prior to COVID, but should we not be aiming for that?
Well, firstly, you've put your finger on the historic challenge, which is one of call volume and call demand, and demand on the Met in so many different ways. And busy officers on patrol with a caseload, and you've been with them, some of them very, very busy and carrying a caseload. I feel for the, what they have been doing in the past, and I think the vast majority of them have absolutely been trying to do their very best in pretty stretched circumstances. And of course, they don't ever do, as it were, nothing. They don't ever go along, it's all quiet here, and absolutely nothing. But they may only make a brief report of what happened. And that may not result in further referrals, but they do make a brief report in every instance. And that does appear to be of actually a domestic abuse or violence of some sort. And The circumstances will always vary. They have actually quite a lot of, if you like, form filling to do after such a thing. The vast majority of these events will involve children, or a large proportion, and there's always a Merlin report, as we call it, that goes off and it goes into the system and goes to other agencies. They will often absolutely come back themselves and follow up, and you know, I'm seeing that perhaps more now, where they're saying, well, we'll just go around and have a word there and see what's happening. But I accept we can all get better, but the whole system needs to get better as well. And society, frankly, does need to change in its attitudes to this. But we can't all be resolved by police action or criminal justice action. That's for sure.
Fine.
I do accept that, but I think if we could try and improve on our bit and keep that learning agenda, as you said, striving for self-improvement, it's got to help. I think there are some wider issues in society that we need to deal with, but I would welcome a fresh approach, and it sounds like we're moving in the right direction of that. At some stage, we might want a further detailed conversation about what that looks like in terms of post-COVID or in a different period of COVID, that it's sustainable and that we're able to deliver it longer term. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Duval. Can I bring in Assembly Pigeon?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. We've seen there's been an increase in calls to the NSPCC, and I think Europol have also reported an increase in online activity, seeking child abuse images and so on. I'm wondering whether you can give us a picture of the trends in online child abuse and exploitation during this COVID period, and what's being done by the Met to prevent such crimes.
Yes, we were very alert as soon as the restrictions came to the fact that more people would be spending more time at home, and very much more time at home, and that might result in young people who are at risk being more at risk, whether that is in from people within their home physically or sexually, or indeed online. In terms of the online work, we've seen an increase in referrals from the NCA to us, but I'd have to say some of that is about a kind of business process increase in referrals. There's certainly been a concern that the activity online might be increasing, and we've taken the opportunity, as you may have seen recently with Publicise, to not only increase the size of our units dealing with indecent images and associated offences, which have increased from a strength of 90 to over 200. But we have also been executing a lot of warrants and doing a lot of high-profile activity across all of London. So we have arrested large numbers of offenders who are engaged either in online sort of live abuse, streaming abuse and that kind of thing, or viewing indecent images. Unfortunately, we think we have seen more young people being drawn into more sort of extreme pornographic sites. We believe that may be a trend, and I suppose not surprising in a way, but worrying. And we've seen more peer-to-peer indecent image sharing. Again, much of this, or some of this, is between young people, sadly, as well. So this isn't just about adults preying on young people, it's also about young people being exposed to this in different ways. In terms of child abuse in the physical space, if I can call it that, there has been a decrease, again, not unexpected, but perhaps we will find out, I hope, but probably due to less contact between, for example, particularly schools and children. So obviously children's services, schools, people who work with youngsters in a variety of different fora, including gang workers, they've all been trying, as have our officers, schools officers, to reach out to youngsters at home who are at risk, online and occasionally physically as well. But we just know that youngsters won't be reporting as much as they once were. So we've seen a very definite decrease in physical child abuse incidents. And we will see what happens now the schools are beginning to go back, and whether that increases again, against the context, as you say, of increased contact with helplines, including the MPCC.
Thank you for that. And obviously, we're anticipating there could well be an increase in cases following lockdown, as you say, as children return to school and all age groups gradually return over the coming months. With this anticipated increase, what action are you taking now to bolster your teams working in this area of child safeguarding? And that's not just in the immediate aftermath, but obviously these cases go on for a long time, so perhaps the medium to longer term. And that also would apply, I guess, to the domestic abuse as well. What are you doing to ensure an increase in resources?
So the first thing I think is we're encouraging all our officers to, be curious, be professionally curious. So that includes the neighbourhood officers, it includes the emergency response and sort of patrolling officers. That whenever they go, as lockdown eases, to meet a family, to meet a young person, to be professionally curious and recognise that possibly things may have been going on in the last few weeks. So where we get an antisocial behaviour call or a call of an argument going on in a house, be curious and try to take the question towards, how have things been going in the last several weeks. We are making sure that our schools officers run drop-in centres and safe spaces as the schools go back, working with safeguarding teams, and we are ring-fencing our child abuse investigators and our safeguarding teams, potentially with even some embargo on leave still to be sorted out at various key pinch points to make sure that we have sufficient capacity from the specialists who are, trained to deal with these sometimes very complex investigations. So we're making sure essentially that we do have sufficient cover to cope with an uptick and sufficient openness, if you like, and availability to encourage people to come to talk to us, particularly young people, but also, of course, older people victims of domestic abuse of one sort or another.
Thank you. It's good to hear you've got the resources there. I don't know if the Deputy Mayor wanted to add anything in particular about work she might be doing with the boroughs, with children's services in this area.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, over the course of COVID, we've had regular calls with local authorities and boroughs, and in particular, obviously, domestic abuse has been a very, key focus, but also those vulnerable children. And we've had a number of conversations with Martin Pratt, who leads for the Director of the Children's Services, as to how those children are being supported and how they're being reached out, how local authorities are reaching out to them. A number of authorities are doing it in different ways. I know that there's a number of authorities are checking in with those vulnerable people that are on their lists and have reached that particular threshold. Our particular concern was with those that were not at the threshold that they would be on the local authority list and subject to either social care or subject to some type of intervention. And that's certainly something I've been working with Lib Peck on with the Violence Reduction Unit, and in working with Lib has been working with the Department for Education on this, because it's those vulnerabilities that often will be going into adverse childhood experiences will be the catalyst for young people getting involved in violence. And that's certainly something that we she and myself have been picking up to make sure that those vulnerabilities are recognised and what support can be put in place. And it is a real concern coming out of COVID that the numbers of young people will have had really difficult experiences during lockdown. We know that their mental health will have been really, really impacted. So that we have been lobbying government for a strategy and some resources to be put in to ensure that young people are going to get the support that they need for the vulnerabilities that were probably there before, but have become more increased and more focused during COVID. But that's a piece of work that we're doing with the Violence Reduction Unit, with the linkage between those vulnerable young people and the likelihood of them getting involved in either violence or county lines, and it all is part of the picture of the work that we're doing.
Thank you very much. I'll leave it there, Chair.
So just moving on, thank you, Assembly President. Section 4. Now I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to bring, which is on PPE, custody suites and bail conditions. Can we concentrate on the questions on PPE and bail conditions? And if I can bring in Assembly Member Janet Arnold, and then followed by Assembly Member Tony Arbour.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are indeed about PPE and given its full name, Personal Protective Equipment, and it's to Dame Cressida. And I'll start with a general question, and then I'll have some specific questions relating to PPE in custody suites and bail conditions. Dame Cressida, all the evidence we now have show quite clearly that far from being the great leveller, the coronavirus crisis has exposed the unacceptable major inequalities in our society and in our great city. And it seems to me and others that access to PPE and the disparate strategies that there are around, if you like, has amplified this and is one aspect of this. Yesterday I read that the Mayor had announced that black and minority staff across the GLA family will have access, will be assessed. And I wanted to ask you firstly, what will this assessment mean and how will this be extra to what is currently being done by the MPS?
We can't hear you, Commissioner. Well.
Very sorry. My apologies. We've worked really closely with obviously the Federation, our staff associations and our support staff associations like the BPA, Met BPA and others to try to make sure that at all times our officers have the right leadership, the right coordination, the right guidance and the right equipment to be able to keep themselves as safe as is reasonably possible whilst delivering a service. And I feel that in the very early couple of weeks, there were some challenges for us around getting the right equipment for everybody at the right time, but we have had plentiful supplies of appropriate personal protective equipment for some considerable period now. And I think we've worked well with the strategic coordinating group across London. John Barradale and Mark Simmons is currently in the chair there, as you may know, at making sure that, you know, we are not, if you like, taking PPE away from other sectors who might need it even more, and also working with the National Peace Chiefs Council, with PHE and, where appropriate, the Health and Safety Executive to make sure that we are equipping our people with the right things and in a coordinated manner. And I'm pleased that officers, I've inspected this myself most weeks. It's obviously a very important issue. Officers, staff, all our staff, including, for example, our cleaning staff, generally feel that they have had good protective equipment and they understand when they should be using it and when not. We've just recently also made sure that all our people can have access not to PPE but to a face covering, which isn't PPE, but if they were to find themselves on public transport, you know, on their way to work or something, and they want to put it on, that would be for them too, for the reasons you would understand, to protect other people. So I am pretty confident around that, and I'm very grateful for the work that the staff associations and others have done with us on this.
Thank you.
In relation to the disproportionality I think you're referring to, we've worked really closely again with the National Peace Chiefs Council, looking at their guidance and as a follow-on from the NHS initial sort of comments about this some time ago, to try to understand, in the absence of the full scientific outcomes, some of which we've seen more of yesterday, of course, in the PHE publication, what are the issues that we really need to be alert to, and how do we work with our different members of staff? I've said we've stayed overall really pretty healthy, very low sickness rates, very low absence rates. And we've brought in, you know, immediately, before we got into restrictions, I brought in a much stronger cleaning regime, for example, and various other things to keep people safe in the workplace. But we have also looked at what any individual may feel, you know, they have as a risk for them, and tried to give sensible guidance around how they can then act from the beginning. And we've reviewed this again and again in the light of the emerging data about, you know, older people being more affected, people with underlying health conditions of certain sorts, and indeed, of course, the data around DME people. So our guidance, which we have been continuously issuing and have again issued latterly, is very much in concert with what the Mayor said yesterday, I think, about the GLA family. And in essence, we are risk assessing our individuals, and they have the opportunity to talk to occupational health and to their line managers and to work out whether we need to afford them any, whoever they may be, and why-ever the reason they feel this, or their manager spots this in them, whether they need any greater protection from the virus. We've had a number of people, of course, who've been from the beginning working from home because they've had underlying health issues, as an example.
Thanks for that, Commissioner. And of course, we know that the Public Health England's report, it gives us a baseline, and it really just collates and puts together what we've all known, certainly since 2002 and other reports. But it's short-term action. But it treats London as one of the how many regions we have in our country. But the latest document coming out of the intelligence unit of the GLA has broken that down and shows quite clearly that you have to deal with issues in the east of London and in Harrow, because these are two spots that have been identified as having the highest levels of morbidity or fatalities. So will you be looking at that report and then looking to see what needs to be done extra in these London-specific areas?
Commissioner, yes or no answer will suffice.
If she hasn't seen the report...
I want to press on, actually.
I suspect that one of my colleagues has already seen the report, given that we sit at the strategic coordinating group. I haven't. If they haven't done what you want them to do tonight, I will. Yes.
Thank you. Right, moving on now.
Chair, do you want to deal with custody suites,
No,
or do you want to put those in writing?
Because Assembly members in individual capacity or police committee members have already written to the Commissioner. So I propose to bring in Assembly Member Arbour, who's been waiting very patiently to ask his question on bail conditions.
Yeah, happy to.
Well, it's not really on bail conditions. It's to do with cells. The Commissioner has told us that COVID has had the good effect of enabling her to snap up lots of serious criminals, which should be putting pressure on cells. On the other hand, COVID must mean that cells can accommodate fewer people. Does this mean, firstly, that many of the criminals that are being picked up by the police are not therefore being held in custody and are being released under investigation regulations, which means that although she's picked these characters up, they're still going around committing crimes? And secondly, how is she dealing with the problem of pressure on cells? That's it.
Yeah.
So we have been arresting large numbers of people, despite COVID and all the challenges that brings. I'm just looking at the data here. On one day recently, we arrested 550 people, which is higher than the average for the previous year, which was 390. The average this period, since mid-March, is about 400. So we've been arresting just slightly more, but not many more, than we would normally do. And we have, as you have acknowledged, we've been targeting those people who are, more serious criminals and higher harm people. We've had a reduction in the number of young people who've been arrested, about 14%, but we have overall kept the numbers up. So to go to your question about, are they all wandering around, if I can put it that way, Tony, on no account? No. Firstly, the charges have only dropped by about 2%. We continue to charge people, but generally for more serious offences, we have not been bringing, people in for trivial matters. And custody is a difficult environment. It's one of our much more difficult environments to operate, quite clearly, in the time of COVID. And I pay tribute to the custody officers and staff, because they've had to adapt hugely. They've had to adapt to lead to virtual remand hearings. So our cells are being used for places in which magistrates will beam in, and either in the cell or in the custody suite, they will have the normal conversation about the charge. That's put a lot of workload onto our custody suites. It's a good thing, because otherwise they wouldn't be progressed at all. But we've had to absorb quite a lot of workload. Secondly, these are confined spaces, and you're working with people who, as with all police work, you don't know who you're dealing with really, and you don't know often what their underlying conditions may be, or whether they are ill or not well, or not ill. So what we've been doing is some pretty strong screening of everybody who comes into custody through a series of questions and checks to make sure, as far as we are able, that they are healthy to come in. We've much increased the cleaning regime hugely, so that the suites are kept as hygienic as they possibly can be. And if somebody does come in with COVID, then they go to, usually we have assigned 2 or 3 cells which are only people with COVID, and they are deep cleaned after every person who's been in there. Deep cleaned is a huge clean. And anyway, every cell is cleaned every 24 hours and after a detainee leaves, and that's quite a substantial clean as well. We have increased the usage of bail. Bail has increased by 19%, increased to 9% latterly, and a continued reduction, therefore, in release under investigations. In January, we were only at 10% bail. Now we're at 19% bail. I pay tribute again to the officers and staff there. Not an easy environment. They've been working at quite high volumes. They've done it very hastily, and they've had to adapt their practices in a few ways that I've described, but many other ways of keeping a safe environment for the detainees and for them. And it is an extraordinary achievement.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. And screen on. Thank you, Assembly Member. Assembly Member Janet Arnold, your questions will be submitted in writing to the Commissioner, and the questions will be in your name. Final set of questions, and we'll rush through this.
Thank you.
Commissioner, the 3 questions. Is the technology working? The 3 questions, a set of questions from Assembly Member Whittle on police staffing, followed by Assembly Member Disma.
Good morning, Commissioner.
Afternoon.
Can you hear me?
I can.
You can. Good morning. Could you just tell us, describe to us the extent of any collaboration there's been with the British Transport Police over the past couple of months?
Yes, we've worked closely with the British Transport Police. Obviously, public transport has been a particularly significant issue for London in terms of keeping key workers able to get to work, and also a pitch point about how we keep London running, or get London running again, and keep people safe on transport. So we've worked very closely with the BTP on violence operations. We've also worked closely with them around stations where they are responsible for inside the stations. And we, of course, have been doing our bit on buses and around bus terminuses. And the big locations where buses meets, tubes meets, underground is an area where we work closely together. We've continued our normal co-working on things like terrorism and other issues. But we've had a very close collaborative relationship, gold, silver, bronze, and at my level as well.
I see.
And with the City of London, I should say.
Have they sort of given you any personnel, as it were? Has it worked that way? I mean, have you sort of had any people seconded from them to you directly?
No, I don't think we have, but we have done a number of joint operations.
Right.
We haven't deployed their officers in Metropolitan Police work, if you like, but they have kept reasonably busy, as I understand it.
I know that Assembly Member Dismore is going to come in briefly, but I'll just ask my second question. Really, is about the City of London, please, as well. I mean, are there any? Have you had any support from them, or is there the prospect of any in the future?
So again, we have a really close working relationship with them on violence and other things. We share our assets and resources and often our training. So we haven't needed until the last few days, perhaps any public order assistance, but we certainly have been continuing with our joint work on firearms and firearms training, on homicides, on kidnapping, a variety of things we work closely together. And in terms of our approach to COVID, the two chief constables of BTP and I have spoken on a number of occasions to make sure that we're giving a consistent approach to enforcing the restrictions or encouraging people to restrictions across London, so that people don't sense any difference. There's been a very good cooperation and collaboration during this time.
Right.
Okay.
I see. Just one factual question, actually, if I may, Commissioner. You might already have mentioned it, but you know, we've had this fall in crime, about 25%, I believe. What is it in London? Actually? What percentage in London?
I'm sorry, Councillor, I actually couldn't hear that question.
Yeah, you know, the fall in crime that's been, what, 25% across England and Wales during this period, roughly. What is it in London?
So if I went back to the 12th of March, I mean, I need to be cautious about these figures because, of course, it's a short time period, so they can change quite quickly. But overall, since the 12th of March, if we compared this year with last year, 30% down overall, 3-0 in offences. Higher in some offence types like residential burglary, a bigger reduction, maybe nearer 40. Robbery down over 50% when you compare 12th of March to, say, last week with the same period last year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Dismore, very quickly.
Thank you, Chair. I think you said, Commissioner, that you're still getting new recruits in, and perhaps you can tell us how many. But are we still on target to meet the recruitment target set for the first tranche from the government? And do we know how many are going to come in the next tranche from government as part of the 20,000 enhancement across the country? And the final question I want to ask is also about training. How are you able to train people effectively abiding by the various rules, presumably at Hendon, which must be very difficult with some of the things they have to do?
Thank you. Firstly, yes, recruiting continues to go well. So last week we welcomed another 350 people. We've also had some returners, as you know. Some specials have joined us, some of whom have been police officers before. We've had a lot of volunteers, hundreds, 500 initially, and now heading, up towards thousands of volunteers. And our specials have been doing much more hours on the streets if they've been furloughed or whatever from their other work. So we've had a lot of energy and newness during this period, and that continues. We're absolutely on track to meet our targets, and I'm very confident about that in terms of our growth. And we are able to train them, I think, well. We have had to adapt a great deal. So firstly, obviously we're not having any large parades or assemblies like we would have done in the past. Some of the things that we use to really engage people and help them to understand the organisation they're joining has had to change. We're doing a lot more of the training online. We use Teams as we update and other online packages and ways of working are actually reducing the time that they would have spent at Hendon and having them under very close supervision out on the streets slightly earlier. And if you go to Hendon, which I do, a couple of times a week at the moment, you'll see people being very careful about social distancing, but still delivering training. There is some face-to-face training in parts. There is some training that has to be, hands-on. We mustn't have officers on the street who have not had emergency life-saving training, which you have to do practically. You can't do sort of theoretically. And likewise with the officer safety training. So we do bring people together in cohorts to do that. But all other training is carefully managed to be socially distanced and or online. But we will, some of our selection processes, there have been some trials going on to look at whether we can put more of those online. And we'll see what happens with the police colleges, whether they think that is right for the future. Back to the point, we must learn the lessons. If there are things we can do more efficiently and better digitally, then we will. But I am very keen that there are certain things that actually are much better done in a face-to-face environment, of which this committee may be one.
Thank you.
We'd be having a different conversation if we're all in the room together.
Okay, thank you. And the question about, do we know how many extra officers we're going to get in the next tranche?
No, we don't. What from the government's plans? No, we don't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. The very last question is from me. Commissioner, councils obviously play a very important role. Local authorities play a very important role, and particularly during the current crisis. Some councils have been very proactive, certainly the one in Barking and Dagenham, which I represent on the Assembly, have issued more fines than any of the boroughs during this crisis, and 1 in 10 enforcement action under COVID legislation has come from Barking and Dagenham. How are the police working with local councils, and do you feel they could do with more enforcement powers?
So we have been collaborating, as we've heard, with other police services and with the emergency services, not least on the what we call the P-March cars, and which is where we go to sort of deaths involving people believed to have COVID. The whole range of ways in which we've been working with local agencies and authorities in new ways in COVID, including, of course, standards. We've had some challenges around licensing latterly in the last few days in particular, where we've been working closely with local authorities on, pubs having drinks out the back, and some challenges around groups gathering and drunkenness, and also potential breaches of the licence. We've worked with councils in manifest different ways, and the trading standards to some extent in this time period. They have been given some powers under the legislation, as you know. I also know that many councils, feel that their trading standards departments have been, quite small and haven't been able to do quite as much perhaps as they would have liked. Not really for me to comment upon. But there may well be things we can learn from this time period that would suggest there might be other powers that could helpfully be given to local authorities. I wouldn't really want to speculate on that at the moment, because I'm simply not expert on it. But I have tried to ensure that the police have stuck to policing, and we have stuck to core values, and have delivered our service in protecting the public in a way that is appropriate for a police force, and not got a police service, not got involved in activities which are perhaps not best done by the police. And I've been very grateful for support from other agencies.
Thank you.
And the way, for example, supermarkets have adapted and put security staff outside all their supermarkets in order to ensure that order is kept and social distancing is maintained. This kind of thing is extremely helpful to the Met. And we're really grateful for that. And the work that trading standards have been able to achieve, even though some places more than others, is greatly received as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. We are
Chair,
finishing now. Deputy Mayor, have you got anything to add?
Can I just briefly ask?
Sorry, who's that? Tony Assembly Arbor. Yeah.
Tony, we agree briefly.
Go on.
Commissioner.
Oh, sorry, Tony.
Commissioner. My question, which I did give you notice of, and by the way, can I thank Helen Harper and the Borough Command for their excellent work during lockdown. My question is on helicopters. Is there a use of unnecessary, expensive and non-green helicopter use, possibly using drones and other methods? And could you please publish guidance on why and when you use this very expensive operational tool? And by all means, write to me now, Commissioner, because I know you've got to go. Thank you.
Yeah. Assembly Devonish, sorry, I omitted to bring you in. You did indicate you wanted to ask a question, but you will get a written response. Thank you for raising this raising this question in the public domain. Deputy Mayor, have you got any concluding remarks that you wish to make to us about enforcement services, local authorities?
Just really briefly, in terms of the local authorities, during the course of COVID, there's been, I think, really good coordination between local authorities and the local police from the beginnings in terms of enforcing regulations, trying and doing that in a sensitive way and trying to keep the parks open, to now and this week, the weekend the Commissioner talks about in terms of trading standards and licensing. I think it was built on very good relationships already, but I think that has improved over the course of COVID.
Thank you. Yeah. So can I now thank our guests for attending today and for the answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report, the discussion and the report from MOPAC attached at Appendix 1 to the report? Noted?
Noted.
And can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members and Caroline Pigeon, Assembly member, to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. Item 11, Police and Committee Work Programme, Police and Crime Committee Work Programme. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme as agreed under delegated authority by the chair of the Oversight Committee in May 2020, and the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely informal meetings with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service? Noted?
Agreed.
Thank you. The date of the next meeting is on Wednesday, 15th of July at 11 a.m. And as I have no other business that I consider to be urgent, I will now move on to the next section of the agenda. So there's certainly no other urgent business in terms of normal PCC, Police and Crime Committee work. So the next item is a discussion about the referral of conduct matter to the IOPC, Independent Office on Police Conduct, in accordance with Section 100B, subsection 4 of the Local Government Act 1972, as amended. I've accepted the report circulated as a supplementary agenda as an item of urgent business due to the date of the IOPC decision, and the consideration of the decision is to be undertaken by the committee at the earliest opportunity. I would now like to welcome Emma Strain, Monitoring Officer, to introduce this item for us, after which I will take questions from members. But before that, can I just say, just bear with me. Before I bring in Emma, Ms. Strain, can I just say that I'd like to note that neither I, as chair of this committee, nor any other Assembly members were involved in the referral process to the IOPC. So, Ms. Strain, would you now like to present your report to us?
Thank you. Yes, I will. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you, Chair and Committee, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you and to the paper I've submitted. As you're aware, I'm the Monitoring Officer for the GLA, and I am also, under separate legislation, acting as the delegate of this committee for the handling of any complaints about MOPAC office holders. This includes the handling of specific issues and allegations arising from the conduct of Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London. This was both a highly pressurised and highly complicated issue, both in legal and practical terms. Practically, it was complicated by the fact that it related to decisions taken approximately 7 years ago involving a separate organisation and members of staff and advisors who had long since left the office and left the employment of the GLA. The legislation relating to serious complaints and conduct matters, where there is an indication that a criminal offence may have been committed, is complex, and crucially, the legal threshold for referring such matters to the IOPC is very low. The IOPC recognises this in its report. It says that referrals it receives under the 2012 regulations can amount to bare allegations of criminality with very little, if any, underlying evidence related to the allegation itself. It also recognises that the regulations do not allow me to do any form of investigation into the validity of any allegations raised before making a referral. This is because it is important that allegations of criminality are referred at an early stage to an independent body to make appropriate assessments, which is the role of the IOPC and, if necessary, the police. Therefore, the clear presumption in these regulations, which have strict deadlines applied to certain categories of complaints and allegations, is that highly complex matters will be referred extremely quickly to the IOPC at a very early stage and where a lot of the information can be unclear. I have at all times through this process acted properly and in accordance with the law, as you would expect. However, with the benefit of hindsight, I can see that I should have liaised with the chair of this committee on this matter earlier in the referral process, as I act on behalf of the PCC. The timelines for making this referral are very restrictive, but I recognise that I could and should have engaged earlier with the chair prior to the referral to the IOPC, and I would like to apologise to you for this delay. I must add, though, that it would have been unlikely to have affected the referral of the conduct matter itself, because I was obliged to do so by the relevant legislation within those same timescales. However, that is no excuse. I should have contacted the chair. I apologise for not doing so. Should future matters arise, I will contact the chair, and I propose to amend procedures to ensure this requirement is formally built in future. You will have noted in reading the IOPC's decision that it refers to failures by the monitoring officer and delays by the GLA in providing information to the IOPC during the scoping exercise. I would like to confirm to you that I dealt with this case in accordance with the GLA's handling on complaints, after taking advice and in accordance with the relevant regulations. At no point in this process did the IOPC raise any concerns with me that I had failed to perform my duties. Every request made to me and to the GLA for information was dealt with in a timely way, and there was no delay or failure to provide information on my part. I know that Mary Harpley, as Chief Officer, feels the same. In accordance with the regulations, I put in arrangements in place so the IOPC could make various requests for information that was or may have been held by the GLA. The GLA provided responses to all of the IOPC's requests for information in October and November 2019. And in February this year, the GLA received subsequent requests for information from the IOPC, asking us to conduct further keyword searches of the GLA servers. This resulted in a further significant data review exercise for GLA officers. The IOPC was still seeking some information from the GLA by early March and confirmed on the 17th of March that there was nothing further it required from the GLA. As such, I was surprised to see the IOP's comments about the GLA delays, given the IOPC was still asking questions in March. At all relevant times throughout the scoping review undertaken by the IOPC, both the GLA and I engaged positively with them to understand the requests it was making and to explain how its systems worked. Responses were timely, and the GLA treated the IOPC's requests with the appropriate level of urgency and priority. I therefore do not agree with the statements in the decision that say there was a lack of seriousness of the referral and the need to provide sufficient resources to collect the evidence quickly. Most importantly, the experience in handling this particular conduct matter and working with the IOPC will assist us in reviewing our processes for handling complaints and conduct matters about the holders of the offices of MOPAC and the Deputy Mayor for Policing of Crime. We will engage with the IOPC to ensure that we not only comply with the legislation, but that we understand and meet the IOPC's expectations when handling these cases. I will update this committee further as these discussions progress, and I am more than happy to engage with other Assembly committees on these matters also. Before this matter arose, I was in the process of updating our procedure for handling complaints and had in fact asked the IOPC if they had any comments on our process. They raised nothing substantial. However, it seems from the IOPC's decision that it does have expectations that the monitoring officer will provide further evidence to support any referral, despite the low threshold in the legislation for the referral. I will be actively seeking the IOPC's engagement and advice to ensure that our processes and procedures for referrals are clear in this regard. I will also ensure that the engagement with the PCC is also clear, and I look forward to bringing the updated procedure back to the PCC in due course. Thank you. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Okay. Members? Members,
Unmesh?
Yes, Member Arbour.
I've no questions for the monitoring officer, but really I have a question for you. Do you really think it's appropriate, given that the former mayor has been cleared of any criminal matter or any matter which is worthy of police investigation, that it's any longer any point in this committee having anything to do with the matter? As far as the conduct or whatever has been said about the monitoring officer's conduct of these procedures are concerned, I don't think that's a matter for us in this committee. I think that that's a matter for oversight. In effect, therefore, I'm asking us to, as a single committee, as the police committee, simply to accept the first recommendation that since the mayor has done nothing, the former mayor has done nothing wrong, we should cease to investigate the matter and send the whole thing lock, stock and barrel over to oversight.
Okay, I'll respond to that, Tony. Assemblymember Arnold.
Yes, Chair, thank you for that. Can I just say to the monitoring officer that I welcome her acknowledgement, and I really appreciate her apology to the Chair, because I've read this report several times and it seems to me that is the thing that stands out. And I really think that your statement that you've made this morning speaks to your integrity, professionalism and commitment to this onerous role that you have to perform. And then to the Chair, I really support what my colleague, Assemblymember Arbour, has said. But given that we have received a report from the monitoring officer, we won't be able to discuss this morning, but should there not be now a follow-up conversation between the monitoring officer, the chair, and maybe a number of members of this committee so that we can explore, if you like, what has come out of her statement this morning? Thank you. I've finished.
Okay. Sorry, any other members? No.
Chair, could I
Sorry,
just
Assemblymember
make a very
Devenish.
brief observation?
Assemblymember Devenish.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I totally support what my two colleagues have said. I think it would be very good, not just for whichever committee we're on, but we have perhaps a private meeting on this. I too understand and accept Emma's apology, but I do think that there's wider questions that we should ask about the process, but perhaps not at this time. Thank you.
Okay, so just bear with me. Yeah, so as I understand the position, and to answer your question directly, Assemblymember Arbour, so I think I'm going to ask the committee to consider the following recommendations to agree. That no further action is being taken by the Police and Crime Committee.
Yep.
Yeah. Secondly, that we note the decision by the IOPC that is unnecessary for it to criminally investigate the former Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, for the common law offence of misconduct in public office.
Yes.
And the IOP's referral of the conduct matter back to this committee to be dealt with by us. And obviously, as I said, we are going to take no action, but just note the decision. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the IOPC's recommendations to the GLA and London partners has set out in their decision notice, and the action that will be taken in response as set out in the report, but also hear what committee members are saying. So we are noting that GLA Oversight Committee intends to resume its investigation, which was temporarily suspended in October 2019.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And finally, we undertake a review of the powers delegated to the monitoring officer by the Police and Crime Committee, with a recommendation that is done at the earliest, that we have a report back by September 2020, 3 months from now.
Yes, agreed.
Agreed? So,
Yes.
fine. So I think we have considered that matter. Thank you, Ms. Strain, for attending, and thank you for your apology. I think that's the end of this particular item, the end of this particular meeting. So I now close the meeting.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.